I'm Dannagal Goldthwait-Young, and I'm a professor of communication and political science at the University of Delaware. And I am presenting a paper that I'm working on with my PhD students, Brooke Malakach and Aaron Oitinen. I had done a project with my colleagues at the University of Delaware where we had gathered data looking at the extent to which support for President Trump was associated with belief in misinformation, but also with epistemic motivations. So what we were calling epistemic motivations or epistemic values were the extent to which people reported relying on intuition and emotion to come to truth versus relying on evidence and data to come to truth. And these are two separate scales, each of which had about 4 different items in those batteries. Full disclosure, I'm an empiricist, I'm a social scientist, so this is very much rooted in survey research. But what we found was that while many people use both intuition and evidence to come to truth, of course, there are some people who rely more on one than the other. And consistent with prior work, we found that there was an association between reliance on intuition and belief in misinformation. And there was also a negative association between reliance on evidence and data and belief in misinformation. Similarly, there were significant correlations between all different political measures, support for President Trump, republicanism, and political conservatism, all with faith and intuition, and negative correlations with faith in evidence and data. But those relationships were far more pronounced in the context of support for President Trump than they were with republicanism or general conservatism. So, there's a lot of literature that explores the relationship between support for populism and support for populist leaders and belief in misinformation. And there's research on the relationship between support for populist leaders and this faith in intuition and emotion as pathways to truth. The concept of a lay epistemology is very much at the root of populist approaches and populist rhetoric, especially by leaders looking to mobilize. It is consistent with the appeal to the pure good people, which is at the heart of populism, and the notion that there are corrupt elites, which include people in institutions of science or higher ed. So this sort of lay epistemology and its relationship with populism is actually ironically quite intuitive. So what we were kind of intrigued by was a lot of the literature from political psychology assumes that our epistemological motivations come first, and that there are these sort of innate qualities that might lead certain kinds of people to be more likely to value intuition and heuristics over evidence and data, and that those kinds of even physiological characteristics that lead to those manifestations, that those come first, and those then predict support for certain kinds of political leaders and certain kinds of political movements, like populism. However, when we looked at our data, while it is fair to say that those relationships were consistent with the data, our data were cross-sectional, and there's an alternative hypothesis that could just as much be true. And that is that it's possible that support for President Trump and sort of taking cues from his rhetoric, which was very much rooted in intuition and gut and instinct, that perhaps Trump signaled sort of a social norm for his supporters, and that social norm was an epistemology, was an epistemological approach rooted in intuition and emotion. So it got us thinking about whether or not we could start thinking about epistemology as a group norm, and one that could be wielded really strategically, especially by populist leaders looking to capitalize on common sense, direct experience, while also being critical of or denying altogether empirical truth and science and medicine, etc. So this paper really takes the approach that perhaps we can start thinking about populist rhetoric and its focus on sort of what we can feel with our hands and the way that real people come to truth, that is a really useful strategy for populists because it allows them to deny evidence for example, the results of an election outcome because they feel it in their gut. And if the gut is the true way to truth, then we don't need to be complicated by belief disconfirming evidence, because if truth is what you feel it is, then you can never be wrong. So that's kind of how the paper approaches things. And then in the context of science, thinking about how this relates to communication of science to the public, we make the argument that it really is dangerous for us to reinforce a linkage between a certain epistemological approach and a political belief. So to the extent that liberals constantly suggest that, intuitive thought is a worse kind of thought, and that's how other people think, that is going to continue to link that epistemological approach with that identity. And as people start thinking of themselves more in terms of their political identity, to the extent that those things have been married, it will signal that, okay, I'm a conservative, therefore science is crap. That's the expert terminology. And then on the other hand, the other thing that I think is useful is thinking about creative ways to reframe trust in scientific experts as common sense. So rhetorically linking, like, why wouldn't you trust individuals who have dedicated their life to the study of a thing when it comes time for you to figure out what you need to do with that thing or about that thing? And so thinking about trying to thread that needle of reframing trust in experts as common sense, and as scientists, putting ourselves back in the story and adopting sort of the tropes of a lay epistemology in ways that really resonate with regular people and adopt the epistemological approach that they value. So having emotional responses to your findings, marveling when something is novel and new or unexpected, reframing our research as our direct experience. If populists will tend to value direct experience over abstract scientific evidence, what if scientists speak to their findings as their direct experience? I think that could be compelling. So these are the things that we're introducing, and I'm really excited to hear what folks have to say or their thoughts about it. Thanks.